What's up? It's Rowan here from Artist Mind Education with the weekly HSC Economic Stats Update. In this episode, I'm unpacking all things to do with the recent ABS data drop of our national accounts, economic growth, consumption, income, savings, and more. So I'm about to dive in, but if it's your first time checking in these episodes, I share with you the key stats and analysis you need from the domestic and global economy to unlock a Band 6 in the HSC Economics course. So let's take a look at the data. Now, great news here, we hit 0.6% growth in the September to December 24 quarter. That overall kicked our growth up to 1.3%, which is a fantastic result. Now, not great, but fantastic, because if we look at the context of 0.3, 0.2, 0.2, that's a significant growth, a doubling of the growth from the prior quarter. And if we were assuming 0.2 to 0.3 growth for that final quarter, we would have ended the year 0.9 or 1% economic growth. So in other words, it's had a pretty significant impact in really kicking us to that final 1.3% data point. Now, alongside this, for the first time since the December 2022 quarter, we've had positive GDP per capita growth. In other words, it's the first quarter in many quarters where we're not in a per capita recession for that quarter. Now, note, across the entire year, we're still in that per capita recession of 0.7%, i.e., the economy is not growing quick enough relative to population growth, right? And so what that shows is that in many respects, the only thing that's creating that growth, certainly in these prior quarters here, has been population growth fundamentally. Now, if we take a look as well, we can see the terms of a trade improved, okay? And additionally, our household savings ratio went from 3.6 to 3.8%. Now, we should zoom out though and still look at, well, okay, in that 1.3% growth, what has been contributing to growth? Because that's going to help us evaluate how things are performing in the economy and therefore as well, what and how we can evaluate policy. Before we do that though, I do think it's interesting to just look at the fact that, our terms of trade did improve. Terms of trade is export price index relative to import price index. So in other words, looking at what we pay for our exports, what we get paid for our exports versus what we pay for our imports. We can see here that they increased by 2.5% due to increased demand for mineral ores from steel manufacturers following the announcement of China's economic stimulus package. So a lot of our terms of trade is determined by our commodity prices. They represent 60% of our export base, which is in turn influenced by China, which is really our largest market for export for those commodities. Now, if we go down and have a look, we can see that domestic final demand contributed 0.5 percentage point to GDP growth. Private demand through household consumption for once actually was kicking and it produced 0.2%, right? Private investment was 0.1%, and we can see that net trade contributed 0.2%, which was nice to see because we'll see in a moment the data shows that of course over the course of the year net trade has had a drag effect actually on economic growth. So let's go look at a little bit of analysis now on this data. And this is Greg Jericho from The Guardian. And, Greg sort of highlighted ultimately that, given that we've had pretty low economic growth, perhaps the RBA, as he highlights here, took too long to cut the rate and more cuts are needed. So you can utilize this in evaluating the effectiveness of monetary policy and analyzing the recent cut to 4.1%. Now, note, his argument is that if you take a look at the data in 2024 and you actually compare it with total amount of production in the year with all of 2023, it actually highlights the economy only grew by 1.1%, not the 1.3%, which is the 6th worst year on record, and excluding the pandemic of 2020, the worst year since 1990. And I think that's certainly something that you want to be including in your essays as part of your analysis, right? The worst year of economic growth since 1990. So what does that say about the effectiveness of fiscal and monetary policy? Certainly on that objective, it doesn't speak positively. Now, of course, part of your analysis might touch upon the conflict in objectives, i.e. the conflict with inflation, unemployment as those other objectives. But certainly if we're evaluating the effectiveness of policy on economic growth, you can see that it leaves a lot to be desired. Now, note, he also acknowledges we're not in a per capita recession. Amazing. It's not a big improvement, but we'll take it, okay? Ultimately, though, I think the key thing that he's highlighted here is that if we look at over the entire year, we can see what is driving economic growth. And this is important because it helps us also understand maybe the role that fiscal policy is playing in facilitating growth in the economy. And we can see that government concessions, public investment play quite a large role, okay, in driving growth. We can see that households, contributing a little bit, but not all that much. And we can see that net exports have been quite a drag effect overall, actually, on economic growth, in part due to the changing terms of trade and falling demand for our commodities due to China's slowing economic growth. Now, underneath all of this, and so I suppose the positive here is to say, well, maybe fiscal policy is working, right? The reason we're having the economic growth that we do is because fiscal policy has been spending big deficit budgets coming to the table, right? And that's a good thing because if we didn't have that, our economic growth would be even worse. So that's a positive in how you might analyze fiscal policy. On the flip side, though, okay, and that's literally what Gregor said here, right? The challenge, though, is that it's not sustainable over the long time, okay, over the long term. And so if you take trade and government spending out, the economy only grew 0.7%, well below the 2.6% long-term average. And so this shows that ultimately the private sector is remaining very, very weak. And ultimately, right, it also shows that while household spending grew, it's still well below the pre-pandemic line. So if we're trying to look at what are the two main drivers that are more sustainable that we'd like the economy to be sort of firing on for economic growth, it would be the private sector and household spending, both of which are not looking great. And so this, I think, speaks to then both in the case of monetary policy, maybe too hard on the interest rates, really squashing household spending, keeping it below pre-pandemic trends. Of course, to sort of manage inflation, but have that on it too long. But on the flip side, particularly with fiscal as well, is it doing enough in actually driving and helping support private sector growth? And you could sort of argue here, looking at the data, probably the answer is no. So it's spending big, and it's driving growth, but not necessarily in ways that are going to support private sector growth, which will be more sustainable over the long term. So there we have it, some analysis that you can use on this data around fiscal and monetary policy and their effectiveness in 2024 that you can take into your essays when you're analysing the effectiveness of recent policy on some of these issues. If you have any questions, let me know in the sort of chat below. Otherwise, I'll see you in next week's episode.